Hello, class. We are going to start reading chapter 10 today on the murder on the links. Gabriel Stoner. The man who entered the room was a striking figure. Very tall, with a well knit athletic frame and a deeply bronzed face and neck, he dominated the assembly. Even Giraud seemed anemic beside him. When I knew him better, I realized that Gabriel Stoner was quite an unusual personality. English by birth, he had knocked about all over the world. He had shot big game in Africa, traveled in Korea, ranched in California, and traded in the South Sea Islands. He had been secretary to a New York railway magnate and had spent a year encamped in the desert with a friendly tribe of Arabs. His unerring eye picked out Monsieur ODay. The examining magistrate in charge of the case? Pleased to meet you, Monsieur le Juge. This is a terrible business. How's Mrs. Renaud? Is she bearing up fairly well? It must have been an awful shock to her. Terrible, terrible, said Monsieur ODay. Permit me to introduce Monsieur Bex, our commissary of police, Monsieur Giraud of the Sûreté. This gentleman is Monsieur Hercule Poirot. Monsieur Renaud sent for him, but he arrived too late to do anything to avert the tragedy. A friend of Monsieur Poirot's, Captain Hastings. Stonor looked at Poirot with some interest. Sent for you, did he? You did not know, then, that Monsieur Renaud contemplated calling in a detective? Interposed Monsieur Bex. No, I didn't, but it doesn't surprise me a bit. Why? Because the old man was rattled. I don't know what it was all about. He didn't confide in me. We weren't on those terms. But rattled he was, and badly. Said Monsieur ODay. But you have no notion of the cause. That's what I said, sir. You will pardon me, Monsieur Stonor, but we must begin with a few formalities. Your name? Gabriel Stoner. How long ago was it that you became secretary to Monsieur Renaud? About 2 years ago, when he first arrived from South America. I met him through a mutual friend, and he offered me the post. A thundering good boss he was, too. Did he talk to you much about his life in South America? Yes, a good bit. Do you know if he was ever in Santiago? Several times, I believe. He never mentioned any special incident that occurred there, anything that might have provoked some vendetta against him? Never. Did he speak of any secret that he had acquired whilst sojourning there? No. Did he ever say anything at all about a secret? Not that I can remember, but for all that, there was a mystery about him. I've never heard him speak of his boyhood, for instance, or of any incident prior to his arrival in South America. He was a French Canadian by birth, I believe, but I've never heard him speak of his life in Canada. He could shut up like a clam if he liked. So, as far as you know, he had no enemies, and you can give us no clue as to any secret to obtain possession of which he might have been murdered? That's so. Monsieur Stonor, have you ever heard the name of Devine in connection with Monsieur Renaud? Devine, Devine. He tried the name over thoughtfully. I don't think I have, and yet it seems familiar. Do you know a lady, a friend of Monsieur Renaud's, whose Christian name is Bela? Again, Mr. Stoner shook his head. Bela Devine. Is that the full name? It's curious. I'm sure I know it, but for the moment I can't remember in what connection. The magistrate coughed. You understand, Monsieur Stonor. The case is like this. There must be no reservations. You might, perhaps, through a feeling of consideration for Madame Renaud, for whom I gather you have a great esteem and affection, you might. Enfin, said Monsieur ODay, getting rather tied up in his sentence. There must absolutely be no reservations. Stonor stared at him, a dawning light of comprehension in his eyes. I don't quite get you, he said gently. Where does Mrs. Renaud come in? I've an immense respect and affection for that lady. She's a very wonderful and unusual type, but I don't quite see how my reservations, or otherwise, could affect her. Not if this Bela Devine should prove to have been something more than a friend to her husband. Ah, said Stonor, I get you now. But I'll bet my bottom dollar that you're wrong. The old man never so much as looked at a petticoat. He just adored his own wife. They were the most devoted couple I know. Monsieur ODay shook his head gently. Monsieur Stonor, we hold absolute proof. A love letter written by this Bella to Monsieur Renaud, accusing him of having tired of her. Moreover, we have further proof that at the time of his death, he was carrying on an intrigue with a Frenchwoman, a Madame de Broglie, who rents the adjoining villa. And this is the man who, according to you, never looked at a petticoat. The secretary's eyes narrowed. Hold on, Monsieur le Juge. You're barking up the wrong tree. I knew Paul Renaud. What you've just been saying is utterly impossible. There's some other explanation. The magistrate shrugged his shoulders. What other explanation could there be? What leads you to think it was a love affair? Madame de Broglie was in the habit of visiting him here in the evenings. Also, since Monsieur Renaud came to the village Genevieve, Madame de Broglie has paid large sums of money into the bank in notes. In all, the amount totals £4,000 of your English money. I guess that's right, said Stonor quietly. I transmitted him those sums at his request, but it wasn't an intrigue. Eh, mon Dieu, what else could it be? Blackmail, said Stonor sharply, bringing down his hand with a slam on the table. That's what it was. Oh, voilà une idée, cried the magistrate, shaken in spite of himself. Blackmail, repeated Stonor. The old man was being bled, and at a good rate, too. 4,000 in a couple of months? Whew! I told you just now there was a mystery about Renaud. Evidently this Madame de Broglie knew enough of it to put the screws on. It is possible, the commissary cried excitedly. Decidedly, it is possible. Possible, roared Stonor. It's certain. Tell me, have you asked Mrs. Renaud about this love affair stunt of yours? No, monsieur, we did not wish to occasion her any distress if it could reasonably be avoided. Distress? Why, she'd laugh in your face. I tell you, she and Renaud were a couple in 100. Ah, that reminds me of another point, said Monsieur ODay. Did Monsieur Renaud take you into his confidence at all as to the dispositions of his will? I know all about it. I took it to the lawyer for him after he'd drawn it out. I can give you the name of his solicitors if you want to see it. They've got it there. Quite simple. Half in trust to his wife for her lifetime, the other half to his son. A few legacies. I rather think he left me 1,000. When was this will drawn up? Oh, about a year and a half ago. Would it surprise you very much, Monsieur Stonor, to hear that Monsieur Renaud had made another will less than a fortnight ago? Stonor was obviously very much surprised. I'd no idea of it. What's it like? The whole of his vast fortune is left unreservedly to his wife. There is no mention of his son. Mr. Stonor gave a vent to a prolonged whistle. I call that rather rough on the lad. His mother adores him, of course, but to the world at large it looks rather like a want of confidence on his father's part. It will be rather galling to his pride. Still, it all goes to prove what I told you, that Renaud and his wife were on first-rate terms. Quite so, said Monsieur ODay. It is possible we shall have to revise our ideas on several points. We have, of course, cabled to Santiago and are expecting a reply from there any minute. In all possibility, everything will then be perfectly clear and straightforward. On the other hand, if your suggestion of blackmail is true, Madame de Broglie ought to be able to give us valuable information. Poirot interjected a remark. Monsieur Stonor, the English chauffeur, Masters, had he been long with Monsieur Renaud? Over a year? Have you any idea whether he has ever been in South America? I'm quite sure he hasn't. Before coming to Mr. Renaud, he had been for many years with some people in Gloucestershire, whom I know well. In fact, you can answer for him as being above suspicion? Absolutely. Poirot seemed somewhat crestfallen. Meanwhile, the magistrate had summoned Marchaud. My compliments to Madame Renaud, and I should be glad to speak to her for a few minutes. Beg her not to disturb herself. I will wait upon her upstairs. Marchaud saluted and disappeared. We waited some minutes, and then, to our surprise, the door opened, and Mrs. Renaud, deathly pale in her heavy mourning, entered the room. Monsieur ODay brought forward a chair, uttering vigorous protestations, and she thanked him with a smile. Stonor was holding one hand of hers in his with an eloquent sympathy. Words evidently failed him. Mrs. Renaud turned to Monsieur ODay. You wished to ask me something, Monsieur le Juge? With your permission, madame, I understand your husband was a French Canadian by birth. Can you tell me anything of his youth or upbringing? She shook her head. My husband was always very reticent about himself, monsieur. He came from the northwest, I know, but I fancy that he had an unhappy childhood, for he never cared to speak of that time. Our life was lived entirely in the present and the future. Was there any mystery in his past life? Mrs. Renaud smiled a little and shook her head. Nothing so romantic, I am sure, monsieur le juge. Monsieur ODay also smiled. True, we must not permit ourselves to get melodramatic. There is one more thing. One there is one thing more. He hesitated. Stonor broke in impetuously. They've got an extraordinary idea into their heads, Mrs. Renaud. They actually fancy that Mr. Renaud was carrying on an intrigue with a Madame de Broglie who it seems lives next door. The scarlet color flamed into Mrs. Renaud's cheeks. She flung her head up, then bit her lip, her face quivering. Stonor stood looking at her in astonishment, but Monsieur Bex leaned forward and said gently, We regret to cause you pain, madam, but have you any reason to believe that Madame de Broglie was your husband's mistress? With a sob of anguish, Mrs. Renaud buried her face in her hands. Her shoulders heaved convulsively. At last she lifted her head and said brokenly, She may have been. Never in all my life have I seen anything to equal the blank amazement on Stoner's face. He was thoroughly taken aback. All right, so that's the end of chapter 10. It's another fairly short chapter for us. Um, but some things happen. We finally meet Gabriel Stoner. I think that's how you say it. I looked up a couple different pronunciations, so bear with me, doing my best. I don't think it's exactly Stoner. I'm not sure. But anyway, we finally meet Mr. Stonor, the secretary who worked for Monsieur Renaud before he died. Mr. Stonor is English, so the titles switch around a lot in this chapter. When he's talking about someone, he often says Mr. and Mrs. because he's, British, English. But then when the French investigators are referring to people, they usually use Monsieur and Madame. So I just put those there to be clear about we're not introducing a bunch of new characters. It's just sometimes the titles go back and forth between English and French. Um, Gabriel Stoner does not believe that Monsieur Renaud was capable of cheating on his wife, and that the two of them were very much in love and a uniquely happy couple. He says that a couple times, like they're super strong as a couple. They're very in love. He thinks that Monsieur Renaud was being blackmailed. He doesn't know much about Monsieur Renaud's past life. Neither does Madame Renaud, it turns out, when they start questioning her. But she does admit it was possible that her husband was having an affair with the neighbor lady, Madame de Broglie. So she contradicts what Mr. Stonor had said, that he thought they were super strong, and then she's very upset and she says, well, it's possible. So Poirot, as a side point, asks about the chauffeur, since he finally meets someone who would have known or worked with the chauffeur. But Gabriel Stoner says, "Oh no, 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 he's definitely above board. He's not suspicious about anything. I would vouch for him." So this is Poirot's crestfallen. So maybe he's a little bit disappointed that that was a theory of his that doesn't seem like there's much to it. I will point out that my thought personally was, though, Stonor was wrong about Madame de Broglie, or not Madame, well, Madame de Broglie, yeah, but the Renauds. He says, no, there absolutely is no way they're having an affair, and then the wife contradicts him. So if he's saying, oh, there's absolutely no way the chauffeur is involved, he's not suspicious, but he's already been proven wrong once, maybe he could be proven wrong again in the future. So we'll just have to wait and see as we read more. Okay, thanks for listening.